Power crumbles in many ways, but few with the grotesque inevitability that awaited King Philip II of Spain. Born in 1527, the son of Emperor Charles V, Philip inherited not only a crown, but a dominion so vast that it birthed the famous boast, "In his empire, the sun never set." From the silver mines of the Americas to the islands of the Pacific that still bear his name, the Spanish monarch commanded lands and seas that stretched further than any before him. He was no mere king of a single nation. He was a world ruler, the architect of the first true global empire. For his contemporaries, Philip stood as the very image of divine authority on earth, chosen, they believed, to guard Christendom itself. To understand Philip, one must understand his faith. He was not simply a sovereign who ruled with sword and coin. He ruled with scripture and sacrament. At the heart of his mission lay Catholic orthodoxy. In an age where Protestantism spread like wildfire across Europe, Philip declared himself God's defender. He poured Spain's wealth into wars meant not only to expand his realm, but to preserve what he saw as the one true faith. The clash with Elizabethan England, the 80 Years' War against Dutch rebels, the bloody suppression of heresy, all were carried out under his orders. The Spanish Armada, though wrecked by storms and English cannon, became the symbol of his ambition, a king who sought to bend nations and faiths to his will. But every ambition comes with a price. Even as Philip wielded armies and fleets, he was quietly fighting an enemy that no treaty or battlefield could contain. If Philip's empire was the body of his rule, the Escorial was its heart. Rising in stark granite in the hills of Castile, the vast palace monastery complex embodied both Spain's strength and its solemn devotion. It was fortress, royal residence, basilica, and crypt all at once, a city of stone that seemed eternal. Philip himself commissioned it as both a monument to God and a symbol of Spain's destiny. Its endless corridors, austere chapels, and royal apartments testified to his vision of divine kingship, power fused with piety, might cloaked in humility before heaven. Yet within those same walls, Philip would one day face the slow, humiliating erosion of everything he built. The Escorial, meant to outlast time, would witness not only the height of his glory, but also the putrefaction of his flesh. By the time Philip entered his 7th decade, the weight of his empire and his body began to betray him. Years of ceaseless labor, long vigils over state papers, and the strain of commanding wars across half the world had worn him thin. Gout had already twisted his fingers and toes into gnarled knots of pain. His joints, swollen and burning, left him reliant on a chair for movement. Even so, his mind remained relentless. He still reviewed every important decree with his own eyes, writing his famous marginal note on one petition, "No." One word that could alter the lives of thousands. But the same king who could command the fate of nations could not command the secret workings of his own body. By the late 1590s, he was often fevered, shivering under heavy blankets, even in the Spanish summer. Servants whispered of foul-smelling sores that would not heal. Courtiers noticed his absence from ceremonies. And though his faith never wavered, there were hints, quiet, unspoken, that the most Catholic king was losing the battle against the relentless decay of flesh. The man who once bent nations to his will was now at the mercy of unseen enemies. By the summer of 1598, those enemies would declare war on him in earnest. Not Protestant rebels, not English corsairs, but something smaller, something far more merciless. The empire over which the sun never set was about to see its master devoured, inch by inch, from within. By the spring of 1598, King Philip II was 71 years old, already an advanced age for the era, but one gained at a terrible price. Decades of war, administrative strain, and ceaseless labor at his desk had carved deep lines into his pale, sunken face. He had never been a vigorous man, but now he was something less than whole. From his early 30s, gout had stalked him, the illness often called the disease of kings for its association with rich diets had swollen his joints until his fingers curled into claws and his toes twisted grotesquely. Writing, walking, even lifting a goblet became torment. His courtiers recorded how he winced with every movement, a monarch shackled by invisible chains of fire and swelling. By his 50s, arthritis had compounded the agony. His knees stiffened, his shoulders locked, and often he could not move his arms at all. He had to be carried between chambers, slumped and grim, his once proud posture broken. Court scribes noted that the king was unable to move hand or foot, not even to scratch his head. Still, the monarch worked. Day after day, the wheel of empire turned only after passing under his inspection. He read every petition, signed every decree, scrawling judgments in the margins with a trembling hand. No matter the pain, Philip clung to control. But as spring turned to summer in 1598, the pain took on a darker shape. In June, fevers swept through his body with alarming intensity. He shivered and sweated in turns, sheets soaked, his mind at times drifting into delirium. More ominous still, abscesses began to rise on his flesh. The first appeared on his right knee and hand, swelling blisters filled with pus, hot to the touch. Court physicians lanced them, drained them, applied poultices of herbs and oils. Yet they returned, multiplied, spread. New ones bloomed on his chest, his groin, his legs. Each rupture gave way to another, what the doctors could not know, with their limited humoral theories and obsession with bloodletting, was that infection had taken root. The sores did not heal, they festered. Philip's fever rose, his appetite dwindled. His body, already weakened by age and years of sickness, began to fail him in ways his iron will could not command. By July, Philip could no longer rise from his bed. He lay flat, his movements limited to his head and left arm. A man once feared across Europe was now unable to relieve himself without assistance. Here lay the true cruelty of decline. Spain's monarch had maintained one of the most rigidly formal courts in Europe. Etiquette around him was strict, bordering on sacred ritual. To speak in his presence required elaborate genuflection. To approach his table, a choreography of bowing and silence. Now, all was undone. The most Catholic king, who demanded reverence from princes and ambassadors, was soiled in his own waste when attendants failed to change his bedding quickly enough. Servants once terrified to meet his gaze now handled his body like that of an infant, cleaning him, dressing him, turning him with awkward gentleness, while he screamed in agony. The crown could command armies, but it could not preserve dignity. As the summer sun baked the granite walls of the Escorial, the king's chamber grew suffocating. The abscesses on his body began to ooze constantly. A smell of putrefaction crept into the corridors. Attendants pressed perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces. Courtiers whispered, reluctant to enter. Yet Philip himself insisted the windows be kept closed, not, he explained, for his comfort, but so that his stench would not drift out into the courtyards, offending the dignity of his kingship. This small command, born of pride, only worsened his torment. The air inside thickened with rot. Every breath carried the odor of decay, the unmistakable scent of a body beginning to surrender to corruption, even before death. Historians later wondered whether this was the moment when Philip himself realized he would not recover. He was still lucid, still sharp of mind. And so he must have known. He had long preached about divine providence and God's will. But when he looked down at his own sores, when he felt the fever gnaw at him, did he see something else? A punishment? A reckoning? By late July, Philip II of Spain, Lord of the Americas, master of the Armada, sovereign of half the world, was reduced to a man confined to bed, reeking of infection, his body covered in open wounds. His courtiers prayed. His physicians bled him, dosed him with arsenic poultices, and prayed for relief. None came, and then came August, the month when Spain's king would cease to be merely sick, the month when he would become a living feast, early August, 1598. The heat in central Spain was merciless, turning the stone corridors of the Escorial into an oven. Inside Philip's chamber, the air was thick with the sour reek of sweat, pus, and rot. And with it came new invaders. The first lice were noticed by attendants as they shifted the king in his sweat-soaked sheets. At first, they plucked the insects away discreetly, whispering among themselves, hoping it was only a minor embarrassment. But the parasites multiplied. Soon they swarmed the royal body in visible waves, crawling across his scalp, his beard, his festering sores. No matter how often attendants bathed him or picked them off by hand, more emerged. One chronicler, aghast, wrote that the lice seemed to breed within the wounds themselves. Whether this was literally true or only the horrified perception of onlookers, the effect was the same. The mightiest monarch of Europe had become a host, his body a living pasture for vermin. But lice were only the beginning. The abscesses that covered Philip's chest, groin, and legs began to attract flies. They entered through the palace windows, drawn by the unignorable scent of decay. They laid their eggs in the moist, open lesions of the king's flesh. Within days, larvae appeared. Maggots. Witnesses recorded that they writhed within his sores, feeding on his necrotic tissue. Servants would scrape them away, filling basins with the pale, squirming creatures, only to find new ones the next morning. The monarch who once claimed divine sanction now lay, quite literally, a banquet for worms. Some accounts even suggest that Philip himself, still lucid, remarked bitterly on the grotesque justice of it all, that his sins were now devoured, piece by piece, by the lowest creatures of creation. The infestation was worsened by Philip's immobility. His body, pressed for weeks against the damp bedding, began to break down under its own weight. Bed sores, pressure ulcers, erupted along his hips and lower back. At first small, then vast, cavernous wounds that exposed muscle and bone. One ulcer on his right hip was said to have grown as large as a fist. Courtiers recoiled in horror as attendants dressed the wound, removing what one chronicler described as material enough to fill 2 silver basins each day. These ulcers became breeding grounds in their own right. Maggots burrowed deeper into the living flesh, retreating when disturbed, consuming the king from within. Even his mouth, nose, and ears were not spared. Flies laid eggs wherever moisture lingered. Soon, crawling larvae were reported in his face and orifices. This was no ordinary death. It was decomposition in life. Philip was conscious through much of this ordeal. That was the final cruelty. He knew, he felt, He understood the full horror of what was happening to him. The courtiers who had once bowed and whispered reverently now struggled to remain in the room, choking on the smell. Some left and did not return. Others came only perfumed, clutching cloths to their faces. And still, the king endured, reduced to something less than human, a hive of parasites consuming him alive. There are accounts of specialized attendants tasked solely with removing lice and maggots from his body, scraping, washing, plucking. A hopeless task. The more they labored, the more the creatures returned. One observer called it a theater of corruption, a grotesque performance where the mighty king, once hailed as God's chosen champion, now played the role of prey. And yet in the midst of this slow-motion disintegration, Philip clung to faith. He demanded daily mass within his chamber, the Eucharist performed beside a bed crawling with insects. He requested scripture to be read aloud, his lips whispering prayers even as they split with fever. To his confessor, he murmured words that have haunted history. Lord, how great are these afflictions, yet they are small compared to my sins. It was a statement of submission, but also of resignation. The man who had defended Catholic orthodoxy with fire and steel now looked upon his own putrefying body and saw not divine preservation, but divine judgment. Still he bore it, not without screams, for the pain was unbearable, but with a strange composure, a grim acceptance that this too was the fate of kings. By late August, Philip's chamber was no longer merely the sick room of a dying monarch. It was something else. A laboratory of rot, a spectacle of decay, a warning to all who dared to believe power could defy nature. But worse was yet to come. His body was weakening, yes. But now his bowels began to fail, his organs collapsing one by one. The king of half the world was about to discover how long a man can suffer before death shows mercy. By early September of 1598, Philip II's body had become a battlefield where every system failed in turn. Persistent diarrhea racked him, soaking the bedding and worsening the stench that already clung to the Escorial's stone halls. The infection spreading through his sores had poisoned his blood. His kidneys faltered. His legs and belly swelled grotesquely with trapped fluid. Skin stretched taut and shiny until it ruptured in new lesions. The once regal frame of Europe's most powerful monarch now resembled a ruin, bloated in some places, wasted in others, riddled with wounds that no longer healed. His heart began to flutter irregularly, his lungs filled with fluid. Each breath was a labored rattle, thick with the odor of internal decay. What no assassin, no rival king, no armada had managed yet was being accomplished by infection and time. The conquest of Philip II. His attendants still tried to care for him, to shift his wasted form, to clean the filth from beneath him. But every touch was torment. The gout that had crippled him for decades turned each adjustment into a moment of hell. Servants would brace themselves before lifting him, for they knew what would follow. Screams. Witnesses recalled how his cries echoed down the corridors, the very same halls where, years before, he had presided over councils of war and decrees of empire in stoic silence. Now the monarch who had once watched heretics burn without, flinching, howled for mercy from his own servants. The palace itself seemed to recoil. Courtiers avoided his chamber whenever possible. Those who passed nearby hurried along the corridors, handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, ears straining against the sounds within. The king was dying, but slowly, too slowly. As the end neared, Philip summoned his children. Most significant among them was his son and heir, the future Philip III. The young prince was shielded for weeks from the worst of the spectacle, but by September, he could no longer be spared. He entered the chamber and was struck by the sight. His father, once the most commanding man in Christendom, now reduced to a writhing, swollen husk, crawling with parasites. The smell alone forced the boy to leave more than once, gagging, pale, overcome. But Philip II demanded he stay, for this too was part of kingship. In one of his last acts of paternal authority, the dying monarch raised his trembling hand and gestured weakly to his ruined body. "Remember this when you wear the crown," he whispered. "Power does not spare us." Whether meant as caution or as bitter reflection on his abandonment by courtiers who now avoided his chamber, his words struck the air deeply. The lesson would linger, though perhaps not in the way his father intended. On September 13th, 1598, the royal confessor was summoned. The king, fully aware his last hours had come, requested the sacred rites. Extreme unction was administered. Holy oil dabbed gently on what little of the monarch's skin could be touched without provoking screams. Priests intoned prayers of mercy, their voices competing with the buzzing of flies. But even in this solemn moment, corruption would not be denied. Flies swarmed the oil, drawn by the sweet scent and the stench of decay. They landed on the crucifix, on the chalice, on the dying king himself. The chamber was thick with incense, desperate to mask what could not be hidden. But every observer knew this was not the serene death of a sainted monarch. This was the final collapse of a man already half consumed by rot. And yet Philip did not break. He clasped the crucifix once held by his father, Emperor Charles V, and pressed it weakly to his chest. His lips moved in prayer, whispering fragments of psalms, even as fluid filled his lungs. The last hours were agony. Philip's breathing came ragged, wet, each exhale accompanied by the fetid stench of decay. His chest heaved, then rattled, then fell silent, only to lurch again. The attendants watched as he clung stubbornly to life, a man who had ruled half the world refusing to surrender his last dominion. Breath. At 5 in the morning, after nearly 2 months of relentless torment, Philip II drew his final breath. The crucifix still lay upon his chest. The monarch who had commanded continents, the king who styled himself God's champion on earth, was gone. But death brought no immediate peace. When attendants tried to prepare the body, it began to fall apart in their hands. So advanced was the decomposition that the corpse crumbled as they moved it. They doused it in perfumes and spices, sealed it in a coffin, and hurried the ceremonies. The man who had once believed his power eternal was gone, leaving only a crumbling body, a terrified court, and an empire about to falter. Philip II was dead, but his death, so grotesque, so humiliating, was not the end of the story. His corpse was hidden away, but word spread. Across Europe, enemies whispered, pamphleteers mocked, allies struggled to reconcile the tale. And in Spain itself, the decline of empire had begun. When Philip II finally succumbed on September 13th, 1598, his attendants were faced with an impossible task. Tradition demanded that the body of Spain's monarch be embalmed, dressed, and displayed with dignity. But Philip's corpse was already so decomposed that even the slightest movement caused it to split and ooze. The embalmers worked quickly, dousing the remains with perfumes, filling wounds with resin, masking decay with spices. Still, the stench overwhelmed the chamber. The lying-in state was shortened. The coffin was sealed early. The public was spared the sight of their sovereign's remains, not out of reverence but necessity, and so Philip, who had sought to rule forever through stone and ceremony, slipped into the crypt beneath the Escorial almost in secrecy, his body too corrupted to honor. Yet while his flesh was sealed away, the story of his death escaped. Across Europe, rival courts whispered details with morbid fascination. In Protestant England, pamphlets gleefully described the monarch's slow decay as divine justice for the Spanish Armada and his persecution of Protestants. Some circulated lurid tales of worms emerging from his wounds, as though God himself had chosen to humiliate Spain's king. In the rebellious Netherlands, where Philip's armies had drowned towns in blood, his demise was celebrated as vengeance from heaven. Broadsheets painted him as a tyrant, reduced to food for vermin, a man whose earthly empire could not shield him from God's wrath. Even Queen Elizabeth I of England, his lifelong adversary, is said to have remarked with cool detachment, "We should not mock the afflictions of princes, for they remind us of our common mortality." But behind her restraint was satisfaction. The king who had once tried to see her overthrown and executed had been undone, not by English cannon, but by the smallest creatures on earth. In Catholic Spain, the story was different. The most disturbing details, the lice, the maggots, the screams, were omitted from official accounts. Chroniclers emphasized his piety, his composure, his final prayers. To the faithful, he died not as a spectacle of rot, but as a saintly ruler enduring suffering with dignity. But privately, even in Catholic lands, the question spread, what did it mean? To some, his torment was proof of divine punishment. Had God judged him for the cruelties of the Inquisition, for the rivers of blood spilled in the Netherlands, for his pride in presenting himself as God's chosen king? To others, it was simply a reminder of mortality, a truth older than empires, that no crown, no empire, no power on earth could protect flesh from corruption. The paradox of Philip's end was inescapable. He had ruled more of the world than any monarch before him, and yet he died as all men die, only slower, louder, more grotesquely, and with witnesses enough to ensure the tale would never be forgotten. For Spain itself, the death of Philip II marked the turning of a tide. His son, Philip III, inherited an empire vast but already overstretched. Unlike his father, the young king lacked the iron will to govern directly. Traumatized, perhaps, by the sight of his father's long agony, Philip III preferred to delegate authority to favorites. The machinery of empire began to falter. Corruption spread. Silver from the New World no longer covered the debts of endless wars. Territories slipped away. Within decades, Spain's dominance in Europe had waned, her armies defeated, her fleets shattered. Historians often mark the death of Philip II as the symbolic beginning of this decline. The empire that had once seemed eternal began to rot from within, just as its king had. Centuries later, Philip II is remembered for many things: the Armada, the Escorial, the Counter-Reformation. But above all, he is remembered for the manner of his death. It has outlived his achievements in the imagination of history. His victories have faded, his policies forgotten, his empire dissolved. But the image of Europe's most powerful monarch, devoured by worms while still alive, remains vivid, grotesque, unforgettable. Historians call it memento mori, a reminder that all power crumbles, that flesh is fleeting, that kings and beggars alike return to dust. But Philip's fate carries an even crueler edge. He did not wait for death to return to dust. He endured the corruption of the grave while still conscious, still aware, still clinging to prayer. And so, his story survives as more than just biography. It is parable, it is warning. The man who once believed himself God's chosen instrument, who claimed half the world as his own, discovered in his final weeks that the smallest creatures, lice, maggots, flies, could humble him in ways no human rival ever had. The stone walls of the Escorial still stand. Visitors walk the corridors, admiring its grandeur, its libraries, its chapels. But beneath the stone lies Philip, sealed in the royal crypt, his bones long turned to dust, and above him lingers the memory of his last weeks. A tale of horror, humiliation, and the final equality of all flesh. For if there is one truth that the death of Philip II proclaims across the centuries, it is this: that power is illusion, that glory rots, and that even kings who once ruled the world may live long enough to feel themselves devoured.